Well, Joe, this is a long-standing question in regional science, which is where does the city end and the country begin? And I used to say it's where the Dairy Queen is. That was my theory of this. But it turns out that they're like, particularly in rural areas, Dairy Queens are like right in town. Um, but uh, but this is a long-standing question, and it is so frustrating from both a pedagogical perspective and from a practical perspective. So the federal government recognizes so many different definitions of what is rural and what is urban. And I have used a bunch of them for different research projects, right? There's a there's a rural urban continuity code that the federal government, we uses in some ways. And it's there's different places where you can slice like, well, what is now rural, what is urban? So there is a fundamental question of like what, how do we determine that difference? It's tricky, and for different purposes, what's rural and what's urban. I mean, the reason why there's these different definitions is that in different contexts they might make sense. So, for example, a suburban area, an exurban area, that is deeply tied to some kind of core area, wouldn't really be rural in the same sense because it is going for many services and jobs to this more urbanized area, as opposed to um, a place that is really quite isolated, and any kind of trip, is at a substantial distance, and you're too far to really work in an urbanized area, well, but even that is tricky, right? Like Manhattan is about 70 miles from Topeka, the state capital, and many, many people, would commute that distance. And the other thing that was surprising to me was the willingness to drive, right? Like that, um, people in Kansas are willing to drive like tremendous distances that I thought were crazy. And then the more I lived there, I was willing to do it, right? Like it's very different. But in terms of your core question of like what constitutes is it a physical barrier? Is it a cultural attitude? Um, I think it's a combination, and and it's unfortunately not as binary as we would like, but um, yeah.
Sounds like you're saying we can adopt different definitions depending on our research objectives, which is useful, I think,
Yeah,
for
I
many
think
people.
unfortunately we have to, but it's very problematic from a policy perspective and from a consistency perspective. I mean, as a planner, density is everything. Like what really, in many ways, separates the rural environment from the urban environment in terms of transportation is, in a rural environment, you have a relatively small amount of people for a fair amount of infrastructure, and in an urban area, you have more infrastructure, but you have a lot more people. So, the person to infrastructure ratio is much higher, which means you can afford more, you can, support it more. And so across the country, there are, tremendous problems about affording the infrastructure we have. But those issues are much more acute in rural areas that have, a fair amount of stuff to support with very few people. And then on the flip side, when you have density and certainly concentrations, it's a lot easier to offer some alternative things like transit. And rural transit is a thing. It's something that we shouldn't dismiss. But it takes nodes of concentration to make transit happen in small towns and rural areas. And that's not always there. Rural transit is a thing. It's something that we shouldn't dismiss. But it takes nodes of concentration to make transit happen in small towns and rural areas, and that's not always there. Um, One thing I should add, though, that historically, small towns had downtown cores that were built when those towns were walking places, and so there often are excellent bones for providing services, at least in some nodes. And so I think that uh, depending on the size of those communities, you can build off that a little bit. Um, but there is also a lot of resistance to density in small towns, which is a shame because it really is a much more efficient way to um, provide services and to help everything.